All right, I'm now at part three of this second lecture on 300, and this one is called Darwinian Perfection. So you can see from the previous part, basically this discussion about ignoring the body, that the Spartan part of the Spartan worldview is in sync with our own, partly, in the sense that, yeah, we have been training people to continue to sort of ignore the complaints of the body, mostly because for a long time we couldn't do anything about them, and we still can't. I mean, it's not as though we've solved the cancer problem. I mean, we can, we're having a problem with this virus problem, and it's not insignificant, right? So you can't just say to people, oh, well, ignore the evidence of your body. At the same time, what comes with this is the search for and the belief in an ideal human form. And again, this is very Platonic. As soon as you use the word form, it's like, oh boy, because Plato talked about, we sometimes translate it as a world of ideas, but the world of forms is really usually better, where there is a perfect form, and we are various different sort of diffracted, problematic views of that or shadows of that. Okay. So the Spartans, particularly Leonidas, show much how they admire not only moral and physical strength, but also physical beauty as well. And which is interesting, right? Because here's a culture which says it, doesn't pay attention to not so much emotion, although they don't really pay attention to emotion, as opposed to, say, the human sensation. Right? They don't pay attention to the sensation, but they do pay attention to the body being beautiful, not the body being functional, which you would think is the point. And okay, so Ephialtes, of course, is going to be rejected, even though he has a Spartan spirit, and that's the point. Is that Ephialtes could easily be a Spartan. But he fails. He has been failed essentially by his mother and father genetically, and this is so he has a discussion. Essentially he's having an ongoing discussion with his mother and father. He says, "Mother, father, you are wrong." And Leonidas says, "Poor soul, may he rest in peace." And this is on page 38. So that's it. It's like, okay, well, no sympathy for him. It's like you just lost a genetic jackpot, and so too bad for you. This basically is a form of social Darwinism, and we practice it. The application, then, of Darwin's theories of evolution to cultures, to races, to peoples is still very much with us. Social Darwinism, if you remember Darwin's, if we take the very basic little, thin skin of what Darwin's theories are, he argued that nature is engaged in the survival of the fittest. And you have to remember that the survival of the fittest here does not mean that, who is more fit, a dolphin or a lion. It's like, no, it's not that. It's who's more fit in the ecological niche you're in. So, who is more fit, the lion or the jaguar, or another big cat, a puma, let's say, that's in the area, in the same ecological niche in that, is there space for two apex predators that nobody preys on, basically? Probably not. So one of them is going to win, and it's presumably the fittest by proof. The fact that it survives means that it's fit. Okay, well then, white Europeans, because Darwin was a European, right? He was a Brit. Seized on this, and they were like, this explains why white people and Europeans in general dominate the planet. This is in the 18th and 19th centuries. The 19th century really was when they began to apply this, because Darwin had to write his theories, right? Middle of the 19th century. So in the late 19th century, Europeans began to apply these ideas to different human branches, different branches of the human sort of genome, I guess you could say. So why were people of color all over the globe being oppressed by white people? Well, the argument went, it's because white people were better. They were fitter, right? That's the thinking, right? And this is burned into colonialism. That basically the white oppressor arrives at a colony, well, what's going to be a colony, arrives at a new place to them, and looks around and sees a bunch of indigenous people living their lives quite happily, and says, but probably not without a lot of technology. And says, "Oh, we've got technology for that. We're going to fix this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to show you how to run things. And also, we've got this particular virus that we have called that does a great job as far as we're concerned in terms of belief, called Christianity. We're going to pass that virus on to you. We're going to make you believe in it, and so on." Okay, fine. So all of that comes along with the belief that you are doing essentially nature's work by subduing races of foreign races, people of color who speak different languages and so on, and you're going to teach them your own language. Okay, so that's the fittest will survive. So it becomes an explanation for why white people rule the world and should rule the world. I mean, more to the point, it's partly so. There isn't just an explanation from religion, which is happy to provide an explanation for why white people should run things, especially if they're Christian, but there's also an explanation for why white people should run things from science. So if you're not particularly a believer in Christianity, you might be a believer in science. So that'll catch you, right? So in the 19th century, this was the explanation, especially in the United States, for slavery and why slavery was a good idea. Oh, okay, it's going to be used for all kinds of things. So here at Western, and by Western I don't mean in the Western world, I mean at Western University, it's not as though we're immune to this. Just before I arrived on campus, actually when I did arrive on campus, this particular professor who you may know, Philippe Rushton, was actually still working. He's a professor of psychology at Western, and he has 2 doctorates, one from the University of London, and he's got a doctorate of science and a PhD, and was a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that's sort of standard, and the American, British, and Canadian Psychological Associations, right? So the APA, the BPA, the CPA. In 1992, the Institute for Scientific Information ranked him 22nd most published psychologist and the 11th most cited. And okay, so that's in the world, right? Okay, so, well, why am I talking about this guy named Rushton? Because this is what he wrote about, right? Writes about. He wrote a book called Race, Evolution, and Behavior. And here's a description of it. Using evidence from psychology, anthropology, sociology, and other scientific disciplines, this book shows that there are at least 3 biological races, subspecies of man, Orientals, i.e. Mongoloids or Asians. So Mongoloid here, when I was a child, a Mongoloid was used to describe somebody with Down syndrome because of the eyes. It's really it's an Asiatic feature of the epicanthic fold. But it's interesting how it's like as if the identity, as if somehow identifying somebody as being a disabled person and that's all they are, it wasn't bad enough. But they also talked about Mongoloid features. Mongoloids are actually a people. Well, it's not. It's an area of the world where you get these kinds of, the genetics have these particular kinds of dispositions. Okay, so Orientals, Mongoloids or Asians, blacks, Negroids or Africans, and whites, Caucasoids or Europeans. So the Caucasus is where mostly a lot of essentially the white people come from. Okay. There are recognizable profiles for 3 major racial groups on brain size, intelligence, personality and temperament, sexual behavior, and rates of fertility, maturation, and longevity. The profiles reveal that, on average, Orientals and their descendants around the world fall at one end of the continuum. Right? So here are the Orientals, his words. Blacks and their descendants around the world fall at the other end of the continuum. So we've got this, an open space, basically continuum, which it's not as though it's like all one or all the other, but it's scattered along the way. Right? And Europeans generally fall in between. This worldwide pattern implies evolutionary and genetic rather than purely social, political, economic, or cultural causes. In other words, there is a difference between an Asian, a Caucasian, and a black person. Okay. More controversial in my work on race differences. In new studies and reviews of the world literature, I consistently find that East Asians, so this would be the same group of Asians that we're talking about, not South Asians, right? This is the difference. So he's make a distinction between, say, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Thai, the Cambodian, Laotians, and so on, the East Asia. He's making a distinction between those groups, Japanese, Korean, between those groups and, say, the South Asians, which are part from the subcontinent, so India, Pakistan, right, South Asia. So East Asians and their descendants average a larger brain size, greater intelligence, and more sexual restraint, slower rates of maturation, and greater law abidingness and social organization than do Europeans. And their descendants who have average scores on these dimensions than do Africans, so at the very other end of the spectrum, and their descendants. To explain this pattern, I propose a gene-based evolutionary theory. My book, Race, Evolution, and Behavior, reviews the theory and many of the data sets. Now, you can just imagine that, this didn't play well 30 years ago. It sure didn't. But people said, but this guy's a scientist. I mean, look, he's got all these degrees. Well, we like what he's saying, because fundamentally it proved, they were like, oh, we're not fond of the fact that, the East Asians, Chinese people, look, so he's saying that Chinese and Japanese people are brighter than white people? Who came up with that? Oh, well, okay. But the main important thing is that we're all better than black people. That was his main deal. So we cannot assume that because Miller shows these sorts of people, like, for instance, the Xerxes and the Persians, that he in any way agrees with them, and of course he doesn't. I mean, he shows them as being savages, quote unquote, and this is why the film is so problematic, and why you can take a comic is, let's say, massively popular. Maybe you're going to sell a couple of million. But if you produce a Hollywood movie from that, you're going to reach hundreds of millions of people. And the thing is going to have a long life if it's a hit. And it was a hit, right? This is the next piece after Gladiator that people were looking for. And remember also that the word barbarian comes from barbar, which is the Greeks. These are the Lacedaemonians and the Achaeans. Greece at the time, there was no Greece. It was a group of different groups of people, the way the Spartans are a group of people, the Laconians are one, the Lacedaemonians are one, the Achaeans are one, and so on. So in the Iliad, you hear about the Argives and the Achaeans. Those are the groups that fought the Trojan War. Okay. So these different tribal groups, basically, who will have their own genetic heritage, will have looked a certain way. Would have been a lot browner. I mean, they're not white people. That's the thing, and it's the same way that people assume that Jesus is white. It's like, no, there wasn't any. No, it's not possible. There were no white people in the Middle East and in Africa, where the places that Jesus was supposed to have been. Okay, whatever. But we have remade Jesus as a white man, and God as a white man with his long white beard. Okay, whatever. This is what remythologizing tends to do. It takes an idea and remakes it and naturalizes it for us, right? So this concept of a barbarian, really, it's kind of like saying yayas. And in fact, that's what Jonathan Swift will do with the Yahoos in Gulliver's Travels. And that's where we get the word Yahoo from. It's just completely fabricated by Swift. So when people talk about Yahoos, it's because they read Gulliver's Travels and said, these people are acting like Yahoos, which means human beings they were disgusting creatures. I mean, they look like us. and they have no manners. They're the worst sorts of animals. They're dirty. They're sort of like jackals or hyenas, I suppose. Okay, so barbarian comes from in the Greek to be ears. When they heard the Persians talking, they heard barbar. They heard this noise, and so they just called them barbarians, because that's the noise they made when they were talking. They were like, "Oh, we don't know what they're talking about. It's just garbage. They're not people anyway." So on page 47, Miller says, 100 nations descend upon us. This should sound familiar. Snorting, snarling desert beasts, howling barbarians, the armies of all Asia, pledged to crush the impertinent Republic of Greece, to make slaves of the only free men the world has ever known. Oh, man. I don't know how you write this stuff with a straight face, without somebody cracking a joke about it. But we see a picture of what is finest, and this is the reason that I was pointing at Rushton and this concept, essentially, of social Darwinism, which is not at any way gone. And you don't, unfortunately, this particular group of folks people I'm talking to now, this class, does not need any proof that tens of millions of people, for instance, in the United States, believe that white people are, by definition, superior to people of color, and that they have a right to run things, and that any person of color is naturally predisposed to be law-breaking and all kinds of other typical racist things. Garbage, right? It's junk. But you see, it's like, well, I wish we could say, oh, well, we're past that now. But we're not past it. And that's why a text like this is so important. So we see a picture then of what is finest, those who are most beautiful. Oh, well, what a surprise. What is Instagram about? It's not actually about people. It's about presentation. Okay. Those who learn the fastest, those who are the most physically perfect. It is, after all, Stumblios, or Stelios, as he is first called, who is the chosen one, the one who has the chance to kill Xerxes, right? Because he is the one who will help Leonidas. Our own culture has focused just as much on perfection, no matter how unreal it might be. It's a full-time job being a celebrity, not so much because the work takes a lot of thought, but because you have to spend hours with your personal trainer in the gym. You have to deny the urges that you have, whatever they might be, to eat, to drink, to sleep normally, they have to be overly tanned, blonde, look perfect all the time, essentially not have private lives. They must be on every time they're outside the prison compound that they live in. People are like, wow, look at the way they live. It's like, it's a prison. Yeah, sure, they've got toys, but that's it. They can only go inside this compound. Once they leave the compound, their job is to be on, and they're always on stage. In the same way that actors, people working, normal human beings working at the Disney parks, no matter what their job is, are considered to be role playing. So that if your job is to collect garbage at the Disney theme parks, you are considered to be an actor, and you are on stage. You are only off stage when you go into the tunnel system underneath the parks, right? So there's a huge amount of bending the will, essentially, to the corporate ideal of the way somebody at Disney works. And you'll see the same kind of thing with companies that have, they've got a policy of this is the way we behave. A Starbucks barista will behave as follows, and there's going to be a code. Okay, so these ideals of perfection, which are absolutely dreadful, are passed on to us with the subtlety of a fire hose. You cannot be exposed to advertising culture without being told how to make yourself better, more worthy of attention. And attention is equated in our culture with love somehow, as if somehow attention is the same thing as love. It's not. Even if people say, oh, I love you, you're beautiful. It's like, yeah, you're beautiful. What happens when you're not beautiful? What happens if you're not beautiful anymore? Which means that aging becomes not so much a sin as a crime. I mean, if you age, you stop being a person. Okay. So current celebrities cannot afford for their images to be tarnished. So say 20 years ago, Julia Roberts was in a movie, Serendipity, I think it was, where she was supposed to have been heavier. She wasn't fat, but she was supposed to be heavier. She has a sister played by, Catherine Zeta-Jones. They're both tall, thin, dark-haired, skinny, Hollywood skinny women. Okay, fine. And but at one point in the film, there's a flashback to, and the plot actually turns on this whole thing, the issue of what does the sister, Julia Roberts, look like. And she's the ugly sister. She really has a few pounds on her. That's really it. But she's sitting on a couch. There's one scene where she has to wear what was called the fat suit. So they made a suit that she would put on, which would be like basically latex, a formed latex body. I mean, it's a prosthetic basically that made her look heavy. She completely controlled the way it was filmed, who was allowed on the set, who was allowed. Of course, nobody was allowed to take pictures because she couldn't let these images get out. She understood very well that if people saw Julia Roberts as being fat, it would destroy the brand of Julia Roberts. And the same kind of, you can see the same kind of thing with people like Gwyneth Paltrow. These days, Angelina Jolie, Charlize Theron, any number of people who are caught in this prison, basically, and are doing, some of them are doing something about it. Of course, they would say, well, it's not our job to do anything about it. And that's true. It's not. I mean, they don't have to. If they just want to be wealthy and, the hell with everybody else, they can. The problem is that millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people really around the globe, don't look like that. Actually, billions. And so they're going to look at these movies and go, wow, I need to look like that if I'm going to be anybody important. Well, it's not going to happen. So then you spend the rest of your life feeling like crap and like you've done something wrong because you don't look like that. Here is the problem, as you know so well. These stories of women are also stories of war culture. As far as I'm concerned, it's the same culture. Go to war, go to the makeup department, same thing. The war on women's bodies, the preparation of the female body as a prize for the male, which I was talking about before. Here, check out some of these clips I'm going to show you. Check this. There seems to be a certain commonality here. Just have a look.